The cage with golden bars. The ship broke through the clouds of Orin Prime at exactly noon local time, because the Valthari Empire had planned it that way. They had told Commander Ethan Voss that noon was the hour of welcome. What they did not tell him was that noon on Orin Prime was also the hour when the light hit the tessellate spires at a perfect angle, turning the entire capital city into a blinding sea of gold and silver. It was the hour designed to make visitors feel small, to make them look up with open mouths and forget for a moment that they had ever felt important. Ethan looked out of the viewport as the ship descended. He saw the spires, he saw the gold. He took a slow breath through his nose, pulled out his small field notebook and wrote 2 words: deliberate display. Then he put the notebook away and waited. He was 39 years old, not tall, not particularly striking. He had short brown hair going gray at the temples, calm face that rarely showed much of what was happening behind it, and hands that were slightly ink-stained because he still preferred writing by hand. Before joining the United Earth Diplomatic Corps, he had spent 11 years as a jurist, a specialist in interplanetary contract law back when interplanetary meant the difference between Earth and its own outer colonies. He was not famous. He was not chosen for this mission because anyone thought he was special. He was chosen because he was careful, because he was patient, and because he had never once lost a contract dispute. Those were not exciting qualities, but then again, the people who sent him were not looking for exciting. They were looking for someone who would come back alive with Earth's sovereignty intact. The landing platform was enormous, wide enough to hold 20 ships the size of his, paved in pale stone that had been polished for so long it looked like still water. The welcoming party was already assembled. Ethan counted 43 beings, arranged in a formal arc, dressed in layered robes of deep blue and silver. The Valthari were tall, most of them well over 2 m, with long, angular faces, eyes that were a flat, reflective gold, and 4 fingers on each hand. They moved with the easy confidence of people who had never once been told that their civilization was anything less than the greatest thing in the known galaxy. To be fair to them, they had 4,000 years of evidence supporting that belief. Ethan walked down the boarding ramp alone, no security detail, no aide, just him in his plain Navy uniform with the small Earth flag sewn to the left shoulder, carrying a slim document case under one arm. The lead figure stepped forward. His name was High Chancellor Varus. Ethan had studied his file for 6 weeks. Varus was considered the sharpest political mind in the Empire, a being who had engineered 17 treaties, ended 2 wars through legal manipulation alone, and once caused an entire planetary government to collapse simply by asking the right questions in the right order. He was, by any measure, extraordinary. He looked at Ethan the way a person looks at a piece of furniture that has unexpectedly entered the room. Commander Voss, Varus said in perfect translated standard. His voice was smooth and practiced. The Empire of Valthari welcomes the representative of the human people. We hope your journey was comfortable. It was, thank you, Ethan said. Your people are very good at scheduling. The view coming down was remarkable. Something flickered behind Varus's gold eyes just for a half-second, because the words were polite, but the implication was not. The implication was that Ethan had noticed the view was arranged. Varus recovered immediately and smiled. "We are pleased it impressed you," he said. Ethan smiled back and said nothing else. They were taken through the capital in open transport, another deliberate choice Ethan knew. It meant he would see the full size of the city, the full height of the buildings, the full density of the population. It meant he would understand in his bones how small Earth was compared to this. The city of Orin went on for hundreds of kilometers in every direction. The population of Orin Prime alone was greater than all of Earth's combined. He looked at it. He kept his face pleasant and neutral. Inside he was counting things, the placement of military architecture versus civic buildings, the ratio of broadcast towers to residential structures, the direction the crowd's attention moved when the transport passed. He was reading the city the way he had once read contracts, looking for what it was trying to tell him, and more importantly, what it was trying to hide. The palace made everything outside it look modest. It rose from the center of the city like something that had decided gravity was optional. Tier after tier of white stone and polished metal draped in banners in the imperial colors, with bridges connecting towers that seemed too thin and too tall to stand. Inside, the halls were quiet and enormous and lit by light that came from no visible source, just a soft, even glow that made everything look eternal. Ethan was given a suite of rooms that was larger than his entire apartment building back in Geneva. The bed was designed for a Volthari body, which meant it was too long and slightly the wrong shape, but it was covered in something that felt like silk and probably cost more than a small spacecraft. There were fresh flowers from 6 different planets in a vase by the window. There was food arranged on a low table, chosen carefully to include only things confirmed safe for human biology, which meant someone had done thorough research on him before his arrival. That told him something too. He was sitting on the edge of the oversized bed, still in his uniform, reading the room when a soft chime announced a visitor. He said, "Come in." The door opened to reveal a young Volthari attendant, barely adult by their standards, who bowed low and delivered with both hands a sealed document case. "From High Chancellor Varus, Commander. He requests that you read at your earliest convenience." "Thank you," Ethan said. "What is your name?" The attendant blinked. Clearly that was not a question they were used to. "Sari." "Commander." "Thank you, Sari. I'll read it now." Sari left. Ethan opened the case. The document inside was 42 pages long, written in both High Volthari and standard translation, covered in the kind of formal language that was designed to be beautiful and impenetrable at the same time. He read the translation first, quickly. Then he went back and read it again, slowly. Then he set the translation aside and began reading the High Volthari original, which he had been studying for 4 months and could now read at about the pace of a careful student. By the 3rd page, he understood what it was. By the 12th page, he understood what it meant. By the last page, he understood what they had done. The document outlined the rite of tethering, an ancient Volthari custom, thousands of years old, invoked in the early days of the empire to create binding alliances with foreign peoples through marital union. In its modern form, it was rarely used, but it had never been formally removed. from imperial law, which meant it was still legally valid, and it had been formally, officially invoked, with Ethan Voss named as the foreign dignitary by the Grand Council of the Empire 3 days ago, before his ship had even entered Velthari space. The rite required him to choose. The Empire had 2 eligible candidates: Princess Sarava, the Emperor's elder daughter, and Princess Lyra, the younger. The document described them in careful, neutral language of titles, ceremonial roles, formal designations. It said nothing real about either of them. It did not need to. And GT snorts. And GT. The document was not about the princesses. The document was about the contract that would follow the choice. Ethan read that contract section 4 times. If he chose Princess Sarava, Earth would be formally incorporated as a protected territory of the militarist imperial bloc. Earth would keep its name, its flag, and its government, but every major resource agreement, every military decision, every diplomatic contact with another species would require imperial approval from the militarist council, quietly, legally, permanently. If he chose Princess Lyra, Earth would be formally incorporated as a partnered state of the reform faction. Slightly better language, slightly more room to breathe. But the outcome was the same: Earth's sovereignty, the thing they had sent Ethan here to protect, would be handed over through a marriage contract buried in 4,000 years of law that most humans had never heard of and could not challenge. The Velthari had done this before. Ethan found the references in the footnotes. 7 other civilizations over 600 years. Each of them had accepted the right. Each of them had, slowly and legally and without a single battle, become part of the Empire. They expected the same from him. He set the document down on the table. Beside the untouched food, he looked at the flowers in the vase. He looked at the impossibly tall window and the city beyond it, glowing gold in the fading afternoon light. 7 days. The document gave him 7 days to make his choice. After that, the right would be considered declined, and a declined right under imperial law was classified as an act of diplomatic hostility, which had its own set of consequences. He sat very still for a long time. Then he picked up his notebook, opened it to a fresh page, and began to write. Not his thoughts, not his feelings. He wrote the structure of the right section by section, clause by clause, the way he had once mapped out bad contracts before, finding where they broke, because every contract broke somewhere. That was the thing about law. People built it, and people always left something behind in the building, a door they forgot, a word that meant 2 things, a clause written by someone long dead who had thought maybe that things should be different. You just had to read carefully enough to find it. Ethan Voss had 7 days. He ordered a pot of tea from the attendant, settled into the 2 large chair by the window, and started at the beginning. Outside, in the corridors of the palace, High Chancellor Varys walked with 2 of his senior aides. One of them asked quietly how the human had seemed. Varys thought for a moment. Quiet, he said. He seemed very quiet. His aide smiled. Good, quiet means he knows he is beaten. Varys did not smile back. Something about the human's eyes had stayed with him. Not fear, not confusion, not the wide-open look of a person staring at something too big to understand. Something else. Something that felt uncomfortably like a person who had been handed exactly what they were looking for and was very carefully not showing it. He told himself he was imagining things. He walked on. Behind a window 12 floors above, a light stayed on all night. What humans do when cornered. The first thing Ethan did the next morning was ask for more paper. Not a data pad, not a screen, paper. Actual printed sheets blank on both sides. The attendant, young Sari, looked at him the way people look at someone who has asked for something slightly strange but not quite strange enough to refuse. Within an hour, a full ream of paper arrived at his door along with a second pot of tea that nobody had asked for but that Ethan appreciated deeply. He spread the right of tethering across the desk, the full 42 pages in both languages, and began building a map, not a drawing, a structure. He wrote the main clauses in a column on the left side of one page and the sub-clauses that connected to them on the right. He drew lines between the ones that touched each other. He circled the ones that defined terms. He put a small question mark beside anything that used a word he wasn't completely sure about. In High Velthari, there were 19 question marks on the first pass. By the second pass, there were 8. By the third pass, there were 3, and one of those 3 was not a word he didn't understand. It was a word he understood perfectly, but the way it was used didn't fit. It was an old word. Old, even by Velthari standards, because the High Velthari of the original rite was written in a form of the language that hadn't been in common use for over 2,000 years. The modern translation smoothed it over, turned it into something clean and clear and manageable. But the original word was older, and older words in any legal document always meant something specific. He put a small star next to it instead of a question mark and kept going. At noon, he sent his first encrypted transmission back to Earth. It was short. It contained the full text of the rite of tethering in both languages, summary of the political situation as he understood it in one instruction. I need every legal analyst who can read Velthari on this document by tomorrow. Prioritize contract law specialists. Tell them to look for exit clauses. Tell them not to assume there aren't any. Then he sent a second, separate transmission to a single person, Dr. Amara Ase, the finest expert on Velthari legal history that Earth had produced. She had spent 30 years studying their system without ever visiting Orin Prime. He sent her the 3-starred words and wrote, "These don't mean what the translation says they mean. Tell me what they actually mean." Then he folded his notes, put on his jacket, and went to his first official meeting. The palace had scheduled his days carefully. Mornings were for formal ceremonies and tour. Afternoons were for what the schedule called cultural exchange sessions, which meant being shown things, fed things, and spoken to in long, gracious speeches about the greatness of the empire. Evenings were for banquets. The whole structure was designed to keep him busy, tired, and surrounded by people who were watching him. He attended all of it. He smiled at the right moments. He asked polite questions that sounded like admiration. He accepted food he had never tasted and said honestly that several of it was very good. He watched the Velthari court move around him, the shifting clusters of officials, the whispered conversations behind decorative screens, the careful way certain people avoided, looking at certain other people. He was reading them the same way he was reading the document, looking for the structure underneath the surface. On the second evening, at a banquet inn, one of the smaller palace halls, small, being relative since the room could have held a passenger aircraft, he was seated near the imperial family's table, not at it, near it, close enough to observe, far enough to be reminded of his place. The emperor himself was a commanding figure, tall even by Valthari standards, with silver threading through his dark, ceremonial robes and a face that had the particular stillness of someone who had been powerful for so long that they no longer needed to perform it. The two princesses were seated beside him. Ethan had read their official files, which told him almost nothing useful. Now he looked at them directly. Sarava, the elder, sat straight and still with the precise posture of someone who had been trained since childhood to take up exactly the amount of space that was appropriate and not one in more. She had sharp features and flat gold eyes that moved around the room in steady, systematic sweeps. She was not looking at Ethan the way the others were, the mixture of curiosity and condescension that most of the court seemed to find appropriate. She was looking at him the way he was looking at everything else, measuring. Lyra the younger was less formal in her posture and more careful in her stillness, which was a different thing entirely. She sat quietly, said little, and spent most of the banquet looking at a point somewhere between her plate and the middle distance, but once, just once, she looked directly at Ethan. Across the hall, it was a brief glance. Her expression did not change, but her eyes were not flat and gold like the rest of her family's. They were a deep, unusual amber, and they were unmistakably intelligent. He looked back at his food. He filed both observations away. On the third day, Dr. Asai's response arrived at 4:00 a.m. or in prime time. Ethan had been asleep for 2 hours. He woke up, read it in bed, and sat up very straight. The old word he had starred, the one used in the original rite to describe the nature of the foreign dignitaries' obligation, did not mean required in its original form. In the ancient legal dialect, it meant something closer to invited under circumstances of good faith. 2,000 years of subsequent law had reinterpreted it as mandatory, but the original text, the founding text, the one that all later versions were technically derived from, had a different meaning. And in Valthari law, which Ethan had studied enough to know was deeply hierarchical about legal precedents, the founding text outranked its descendants. He got up, made tea, and sat at the desk. It wasn't an exit yet. It was a crack, a hairline fracture in a wall that looked solid. He needed to find where the crack went. He sent back one message: keep going. Look at everything written by Empress Velorath. She authored the original. Right, find out why. By the fourth day, the transmissions from Earth were coming in fast. He had 8 analysts working in overlapping shifts, crossing time zones to cover the clock. They were sending him sections, arguments, cross-references. He was synthesizing it all, building the full picture, holding the pieces up against each other to see where they fit. That afternoon, during a break between a ceremonial tour and an evening reception, he did something that was not on the schedule. He sent a formal, polite request through the correct palace channels asking for a private meeting with Princess Sarava. The request was framed as a desire to better understand the cultural significance of the right from someone directly involved in it. It was completely reasonable. It was almost impossible to refuse without appearing rude. They gave him 30 minutes in a formal reception room with 2 court witnesses present. He sat across from Sarava and folded his hands on the table between them. She sat in her precise, trained posture and looked at him with those measuring eyes. "You requested this meeting," she said. Her standard was perfect, cold and direct. He liked it immediately. "I did," he said. "I want to ask you something honest, and I want to tell you that whatever you say will not leave this room as far as I am concerned." Something moved behind her eyes. "The witnesses will report the facts of what was said. I'm not asking you to say anything that can't be reported." He paused. "Were you consulted before the right was invoked?" The silence lasted 4 seconds. In a negotiation, 4 seconds is a long time. "No," Sarava said. "Does that bother you?" Another silence. "What I feel about it is not relevant to the law." "I know," Ethan said. "I'm not asking about the law. I'm asking about you." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said very quietly, "Yes, it bothers me." And then, because she was Sarava, she straightened slightly and added, "But I don't see how that matters." "It might," he said. "Thank you for being honest." He met with Princess Lyra the following morning in a garden courtyard that was technically a public space but was empty of everyone except one guard, standing at a respectful distance. Lyra was already there when he arrived, standing beside a low fountain looking at the water. She turned when he approached and spoke. Before he could, "You met with my sister yesterday." "I did. She didn't tell me what was said." "I know. I asked her not to, and she respected that, which told me something about her." Lyra studied him. "What do you want from me?" Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I want to understand what you want, not from me, just in general. What do you want?" It was clearly not the question she had expected. She turned back to the fountain. For a while she said nothing. Then she said, in a voice that was careful and quiet and slightly tired, "I want the people who have no power in this empire to have more of it. I have spent years documenting why the current system fails them. I have more data than I know what to do with and no way to act on any of it." "Why not?" She looked at him. "Because in this empire, information without authority is just paper." Ethan nodded slowly. "I know that feeling," he said. "I've been a lawyer." She stared at him for one moment. Then, to his mild surprise, she almost smiled. He left the garden shortly after. He walked back to his suite, sat at the desk, looked at his notes, and sent one short message to Earth. It said, "I know what I'm doing. Stand by, trust me." Then he poured the last of the cold tea, picked up his pen, and got back to work. He had 3 days left. The document was almost mapped. The crack in the wall was getting wider. And somewhere in the footnotes of a 2,000-year-old law, written by a long-dead empress, Ethan Voss was beginning to see a door. Not the door they had given him. A different one. He started writing the counter-proposal at midnight, and he did not stop until the sun came up over the golden spires of Orin Prime and filled the room with light. The 7th day. The morning of the 7th day arrived. the way important mornings always do. Ordinary on the outside and enormous underneath. The sun came up over Orin Prime the same way it always did, turning the spires gold and filling the capital city with light. The market districts opened, the transit lines filled up, children went to school, people bought food and argued about small things and went about the business of being alive in the largest civilization in the known galaxy, most of them unaware that in a few hours something was going to happen in the grand hall of the Tessellate Palace that none of them would ever quite forget. In his suite, Ethan Voss had already been awake for 2 hours. He had not slept much in the last 3 days. His desk was covered in pages, printed sheets, handwritten notes, transmission printouts, legal diagrams. He had drawn himself to track how each clause connected to the ones beside it. The food tray from the previous evening was mostly untouched. The teapot was empty. He had read the final version of his counter-proposal 4 times in the night, finding small things to sharpen each time, and now it sat in a single, slim document on the cleared center of the desk, printed cleanly on plain paper, and beside it sat one small data chip onto which it had all been copied. He looked at both of them for a while. Then he got up, went to the washing room and cleaned up carefully. He shaved, he combed his hair, he put on his uniform, the plain Earth Navy duty uniform he had brought specifically for this moment, dark blue, pressed with a small Earth flag on the left shoulder. He had been offered Velthari diplomatic robes for the ceremony. He had thanked them, set the robes aside, and never put them on. He looked at himself in the mirror, a plain man in a plain uniform. Ink stains still faintly visible on the side of his right hand because it never quite came off, no matter how carefully he scrubbed. He did not look like a hero. He did not look like a villain. He looked like a person who had done his homework and was now going to turn it in. That was fine. That was exactly right. He picked up the data chip, put it in his pocket, left the document on the desk, walked to the door and opened it. Young Sari was waiting in the corridor. As had been arranged, the attendant's eyes moved to Ethan's uniform, then to the absent diplomatic robes, and something flickered across that young face, not quite surprised, not quite concerned, something in between. "Commander," Sari said carefully, "the ceremony begins in 1 hour. The Chancellor's office sent robes." "I saw them," Ethan said pleasantly. "I'm ready. Shall we go?" Sari opened his mouth, closed it, and then bowed slightly and led the way. The grand hall of the Tessellate Palace was the largest enclosed space Ethan had ever stood in. It was built, according to the historical notes he had read, to hold the full convened court of the empire. Every high official, every senior council member, every diplomatic representative of every incorporate territory and allied world. On this day, it was exactly that full. The chamber stretched so wide and so high that the far end was slightly hazy, and the ceiling, which was made of some kind of treated crystal, let in the noon light in long white columns that fell across the polished stone floor like bars. Ethan walked in alone. That had caused its own quiet drama. Chancellor's office had sent that morning a full formal escort, 12 Imperial Guards, 2 senior officials, ceremonial herald. Ethan had thanked them all warmly and told them he would walk in alone. There had been a 20-minute standoff. conducted entirely in polite language, at the end of which Ethan had still not changed his mind, and the escort had retreated to discuss it with superiors. By the time a decision came back, there was no time left to argue. He walked in alone. 40,000 people watched him cross the floor of the grand hall. They were arranged in tiered galleries, on both sides, seated in order of rank. The sound of that many beings in one space, even mostly silent, was a low, constant hum, the breath and movement of a crowd. As Ethan walked, that hum slowly, gradually dropped away. By the time he reached the center of the floor, directly below the tallest column of light, the grand hall was very nearly quiet. At the far end, on the raised platform that held the tessellate throne, the Emperor of the Valthari Empire sat, waiting. He was flanked by the full Grand Council, 12 figures in black and silver robes arranged in a precise arc. High Chancellor Vera stood at the Emperor's right hand. Princess Sarava and Princess Lyra were seated in formal positions at the left, both still, both composed, both watching Ethan with very different expressions. Sarava's face was a careful mask. Lyra's hands, he noticed, were folded very tightly in her lap. The herald spoke, and his amplified voice filled the hall completely. He announced the purpose of the gathering. He announced the rite of tethering, its history, its function. He announced that Commander Ethan Voss of Earth had been given 7 days to consider, and that those 7 days had now concluded. Then formally he asked, "Commander Voss, representative of the human people, having observed the rite in full, do you now bring your choice to the Empire?" Every set of eyes in the grand hall was on Ethan. He reached into his pocket, his fingers touched the data chip. He left it there for a moment and just breathed a slow, quiet breath, the kind that clears the mind and steadies the hands. He had chosen the moment carefully. He had thought about how to speak and what to say, and he had decided in the end that plain was better than dramatic, because plain was harder to dismiss. Drama could be called performance. Plain words stated clearly were just facts. He spoke loudly enough to be heard, without raising his voice. "I do," he said, "but before I give my answer, I need to make a legal point. With the court's permission." A murmur moved through the gallery. High Chancellor Varus's expression, even from this distance, tightened almost invisibly. The Emperor raised one hand slightly, which the herald interpreted as permission. Ethan nodded his thanks. He kept his posture relaxed. He kept his voice even. And he began. The rite of tethering was written in its founding form by Empress Velorath in the 412th year of the Empire. That original document is the root text from which all later versions of the rite are legally derived. Under Valthari legal precedence law, a root text outranks its revisions in cases of interpretive conflict. I believe the court would agree with that. He paused. Nobody disagreed. The murmur in the gallery had gone quiet again. In the root text, the foreign dignitary is described not as required to participate in the rite, but as invited under circumstances of good faith. The word used is Vethran, which in the high Valthari of Empress Velorath's era carries a meaning distinct from obligation. My legal team and I spent 7 days confirming this across 12 independent scholarly sources, including 3 housed in the Imperial Archive itself. Another murmur. This one was different. Unsteady. Empress Velorath also included in the root text of the rite a clause which has not appeared in any revised version since the 890th year of the Empire. Clause 7, subsection 14. He paused. Just one breath, it states that a foreign dignitary may decline the rite entirely and without diplomatic consequence, but only if they can demonstrate that the rite was invoked not in genuine alliance-seeking, but as an instrument of political coercion. In that case, the dignitary is granted the right to present their own terms of engagement. The murmur in the gallery was not quiet. Now, it was wide and rising and confused, the sound of 40,000 people reacting to something they had not been prepared for. At the front of the hall he could see Vera speaking quickly and quietly to someone beside him. He could see one of the junior council members pulling up something on a handheld screen with urgent fingers. He could see the Emperor, whose expression had not changed at all. The Emperor was simply watching him. Ethan reached into his pocket and took out the data chip. He walked forward 3 steps, leaned down and placed it gently on the polished floor of the grand hall. Then he straightened up. "I have prepared Earth's counter proposal," he said, "a mutual sovereignty compact, an alliance between equals. It covers trade, mutual defense, cultural exchange, and legal cooperation. It is written in full accordance with Valthari law and has been reviewed by legal specialists from both our peoples. A copy is on that chip." He looked up at the Emperor directly. "Earth did not come here to become part of the Empire. Earth came here to stand beside it. We believe those are different things, and we believe the difference matters." He clasped his hands in front of him and waited. The grand hall was so quiet that he could hear the faint sound of the crystal ceiling adjusting to the movement of the sun. It lasted 11 seconds. He counted them. He had nothing else to do but stand there in his plain uniform, in a column of white light, and count the seconds of silence of an empire that had not been surprised in a very long time. Then the sound came back, not a murmur this time, but a full rising wave of it. 40,000 voices at once, breaking in every direction. He could not understand most of what was being said. He did not need to. He could hear the shape of it. Confusion, argument, shock, the sound of people trying to figure out what had just happened. He looked at the 2 princesses. Sarava was looking back at him with an expression that was still almost perfectly controlled, but not entirely. There was something in it that he thought, if he was reading her correctly, might have been the private expression of someone who had just watched someone else do something she wished she had thought of first. Lyra was not controlled at all. Her hands had unfolded from her lap. Her amber eyes were bright, and she was looking at him with an expression that was open and startled, and something that was very close to relief. He looked away from both of them and back at the Emperor, who had still not moved and whose expression had still not changed. The herald was struggling to restore order. Varus was speaking urgently into the Emperor's ear. The junior council members were in visible disarray, some of them reading, some of them arguing with each other in low, rapid voices. Ethan stood in the center of it all, patient and still, and waited. He had done the work. He had placed it on the floor. Now it belonged to Olive, them, and whatever came next. One thing was already true and could not be Untrue, he had stood in the grand hall of the greatest empire in the galaxy alone, in a plain uniform with an ink stain on his hand, and said no. Not rudely, not with anger. Just no, clearly, legally, and with evidence. He thought distantly of the 8 analysts back on Earth who had worked in rotating shifts for 6 days without sleep to help him build this. He thought of Dr. Ase, who had sent him 20 pages of historical analysis at 3:00 in the morning because she was too excited to stop. He thought of all the humans across all the long history of being human who had sat in rooms with bad contracts and looked for the hidden door. He thought, we have always done this. This is what we do. The herald finally restored enough order for the emperor to be heard. The emperor of the Volthari Empire, ruler of the greatest civilization in the known galaxy, looked at the small human standing alone on the floor of his grand hall, and for the first time in living memory, in a voice that the broadcast systems carried to every corner of the empire, he said, we will recess to consider. It was not a yes, but it was not a no. And in the silence that followed, as the broadcast cut to hold screen across 10 billion receivers, the 11 seconds played on repeat. A human standing in the light, placing a chip on the floor and waiting, just waiting. The galaxy watched. The silence that followed. The recess lasted 4 hours. Ethan was taken to a waiting room that was smaller than everything else in the palace, but still the size of a comfortable house. It had chairs, a low table, and a window that looked out on an interior courtyard where a tree with pale blue leaves stood in the afternoon light. He was not offered tea. He was not offered food. He sat in one of the chairs, folded his hands in his lap, and waited. He was good at waiting. He had spent a lot of his life waiting in courtrooms, in mediation halls, outside closed doors, where the people inside were deciding things. Waiting was just thinking with nowhere to go. He thought about what was happening in the rooms he couldn't see. He could map it out with reasonable confidence because he had studied enough of the empire's political structure to know roughly who would be saying what. The militarist faction, High Chancellor Varys's coalition, would be furious. They had engineered the right carefully. They had selected the timing, prepared the contract language, arranged the broadcast. They had expected a simple ceremony followed by a clean legal outcome. Instead, they had gotten a human standing in the center of their grand hall on live broadcast, citing their own forgotten law back at them. The fury would be real, and it would be loud. The reform faction would be quieter and more complicated. Lyra had told him they had wanted change for years, but had no leverage. He had just handed them a piece of leverage in front of 10 billion people. They would be calculating what to do with it. The emperor was the variable he could not map with confidence. The emperor had not shown surprise in the grand hall. He had not shown anger. He had shown nothing, which was itself a kind of information. A man who showed nothing in that moment was not a man who had been broken. He was a man who was thinking. That made him more interesting and more careful than Ethan had originally assumed. After 2 hours, the door opened and a senior court official came in, sat across from him, and said in a very controlled voice that the counter proposal as presented had certain elements that required clarification, and would Commander Voss be willing to specify his intentions regarding the mutual defense provisions. Ethan answered the questions, all of them, clearly and without hesitation, because he had anticipated most of them and prepared answers, and the ones he hadn't anticipated he could answer from first principles because he had built the compact himself and knew every word of it. The official left. 20 minutes later, a different official came in and asked about the trade provisions. Ethan answered those too. This happened 3 more times. Different officials, different sections. Each time the questions were sharper and more specific, which told him that whoever was reviewing the compact on the other side was reading it carefully and was good at what they were doing. He found he didn't mind. He had written it to survive careful reading. He had written it the way he wrote everything, assuming the other side was at least as smart as he was in preparing. Accordingly, between the 4th and 5th officials, the door opened and someone else came in. It was Sarava. She was not accompanied by court witnesses this time, which meant this visit was either unofficial or operating under a different kind of authority. She sat down across from him with the same precise posture as always, but something about her was slightly different. A tension in the line of her jaw, a particular alertness in her flat gold eyes. That was well done, she said without preamble in the hall. Thank you, he said. I want to be clear that I am not here to offer anything formal. She folded her hands on the table. I am here because I am curious about something. Ask. How long did you know you were going to do that from the beginning? Ethan considered the question honestly. I knew by the 3rd page of the right that they were using it as a trap. I knew there was probably something in the original text that could change the terms. I didn't know exactly what until the 4th day when my team found the Velurath clause. And between the 1st page and the 4th day, I just kept reading. She looked at him steadily. That is not a dramatic answer. No, he agreed, it isn't. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, my faction wanted to use the right to bind your people to the military apparatus. I want you to know that I was not part of that decision. I was told about it the same day you were. A pause, which is its own answer to your earlier question. I know, Ethan said. I figured that out. She looked at him. How? Because of how you looked at me at that first banquet. You weren't watching me the way the rest of them were. You were watching the situation. You were reading it the same way I was. Someone who helped design the trap doesn't need to read the room. They already know what's in it. Sarava's expression did not change, but something in it shifted very slightly, the way a very still body of water shifts when something moves underneath it. She stood straight in her robes and said, the council is arguing. Varus wants to reject the compact outright and classify your invocation of the Velurath clause as legally invalid. On what grounds? He hasn't found them yet, but he is looking. She paused at the door. Compact you wrote, it is good law. I reviewed a copy in the last hour. It is genuinely good law. She said it the way someone admits something they didn't expect to have to admit. Then she left. He sat with that for a while. A person like Sarava calling something good law was not a small thing. It was the closest thing to an endorsement he was going to get from that corner of the room. The 5th official came and went. Then There was a long silence, and the afternoon light through the window changed angle, and Ethan watched the pale blue tree move slightly in a wind he couldn't feel. Then the door opened again, and it was not an official. It was the Emperor. He came in alone, without guards, without attendants, without ceremony. He was still in his formal robes, but he had removed the outer layer, the part with all the medals and insignia, and he looked without it slightly more like a person and slightly less like a monument. He sat across from Ethan. He was very tall, even seated, and his gold eyes were sharper up close than they had appeared from across the grand hall. He looked at Ethan for a long moment, without speaking. Then he said in High Volthari, "You speak our language?" Ethan answered in High Volthari, imperfectly, but enough. The Emperor seemed to find this mildly interesting. He switched to Standard. "Without comment, I want to ask you something, and I want an honest answer." "All right. How did you know the Velurath clause existed? Our own legal scholars hadn't referenced it in over a century. We checked. It was not in any document you were given access to." "It wasn't in any document I was given," Ethan said, "but it was referenced in a footnote in the historical annex of the right, footnote 37. It described the original version of the document without quoting it. I asked my team to find the original." He paused. "Your archivists were very cooperative. They probably didn't know why I was asking." The Emperor was quiet for a moment. Then, and if the clause hadn't existed, if the original text had said what the revision says, Ethan thought about this honestly, I would have found something else, or I would have built a different argument. The compact was finished by day 5. I had it ready regardless because I knew I needed to put something on the table. The Velurath clause was what made it legally clean, but the compact itself was always the point. Why, the Emperor asked, why not simply choose? Either choice would have given your people peace, safety, resources. Either choice would have given us a cage, Ethan said, a very comfortable one, but a cage. Your empire has incorporated 32 civilizations in the last 600 years that way. In most cases, within 4 generations, their governments are decorative and their resources are imperial. I read the histories. He met the Emperor's eyes. We didn't travel to the stars to end up as a territory, and I didn't come here to sign that contract. The Emperor looked at him. The expression on that long, sharp face was unreadable. Then he said something that Ethan had not expected. How long, the Emperor said, has your species been doing this, fighting things larger than itself through this method? Reading, finding the small door. Ethan thought about it, really thought about it. Since before we had writing, he said. Finally, since the first time a smaller group of people needed to survive a larger one, and couldn't do it by fighting. We've been making deals and finding loopholes, and reading the fine print for about 6,000 years. We've had a lot of practice. The Emperor was still for a long time. Then he said quietly, not quite to himself, we have been in space for 4,000 years. We have never lost a political contest. I know, Ethan said, and then because it was honest and he thought the Emperor deserved honesty, I'm sorry if today was difficult. That wasn't the intention. The intention was just to be here as equals. That's all Earth wants. The Emperor looked at him for another Long moment, then he rose. He straightened to his full height, which was considerable, and looked down at the small human in the plain uniform. The council will reach a decision by evening, he said. Clear's throat. I will tell you now informally that Chancellor Varus will not find valid grounds to reject the Velorath invocation. The clause exists. It is legal. He is going to be very unhappy about that. I imagine so, Ethan said. The Emperor moved toward the door. Then he stopped and said, without turning, your compact, the mutual defense provisions, they are written to protect both parties equally. Yes, Ethan said. Most agreements written by a smaller power protect only themselves. I know, Ethan said, but we're not interested in a defensive agreement. We're interested in a partnership. Partnerships go both ways. The Emperor left. Ethan sat alone in the quiet room and let out a very long, slow breath that he felt like he had been holding for 7 days. Outside, the pale blue tree moved in the wind. Inside, somewhere in the deep rooms of the palace, the political structure of the greatest empire in the known galaxy was quietly, irreversibly beginning to shift. And on 10 billion screens across the known galaxy, the 11 seconds played again and again. Human, a column of light, a data chip, placed on a floor, and people who had never thought much about Earth began, for the first time, to wonder.